Today we're going to have a code reading session, and I'll explain what that means. So my name is Madelene Campos. I'm originally from Chicago. I have a music background, all my degrees in music, never got a computer science degree, but did go to a boot camp 7 years ago. And so I've been doing this. I've been coding in Python professionally for about 4 years, and I was doing Ruby prior to that, a little bit of JavaScript. Okay, what are we going to gain from a code reading session? Hopefully something. Reading code can be difficult. It's almost like we learn how to write it before even knowing how to read and understand it, which doesn't make much sense, but it happens. I recall asking one of my coworkers at my last job, who's kind of a mentor to me, like how she just always figured things out so efficiently, and she'd fix a bug like that and all that. And she just said, I just read the code. And so I'm like, well, I do too, but I don't really understand what I'm reading. So, but now looking back, I'm like, yeah, that's really all there is to it. So today I hope to give you guys some techniques for reading code, a better understanding of precisely what code is doing, ability to read and understand somebody else's code, because you'll have to do that. And just a reminder that this talk is not about PRs or code reviews. That's a whole other basket. Why read someone else's code? Well, it's important to keep a learning mindset when approaching and reading other people's code, because the person who implemented the feature or did something, they have more of like a three-dimensional mental model of what they did. They have more context. And sometimes when you read it, you just see what's in front of you without having that context. So it's important to kind of be curious and not like jump right in and think, oh, I'm going to change this. Or you have to really like read and dig deeper and deeper. Maybe you have to fix a bug. So you have to read a new code base and figure out what the heck's happening and then figure out how to fix it. Maybe you're just curious and want to learn a new language or learn a new framework. And maybe you want to contribute to open source projects. So you can't really take the code out on the balcony and read it like a book, because usually most code doesn't run in a linear fashion like that. So it can't really be read like that either. Maybe there's object-oriented programming. So there's a lot of like, there's a class that's inheriting from something else. So you have to keep kind of like tracing back where the initial code is implemented and read what that does. There's a lot of jumping around pretty much and layers of abstraction. So since the code doesn't execute linearly, you can't really read it that way either. So a tip for getting started, I'm going to use a Django app example. What I would do is I will get the code from a remote environment like GitHub, Bitbucket, basically like where the code lives online, and put it on my computer. And then I'll create a virtual environment just to hold all those libraries that code needs, rather than like tossing them on my computer and blowing things up. Just keep it in that little virtual environment. And then I'll try to get it running. So then I could see how the app works in the browser, or just like see what's going on. And then if there are tests, I'll try running those. Sometimes there aren't any. And if there's a README file or documentation, that's very helpful to read through as well. By the way, if you guys ever have questions, jump right in. This is informal. So, okay, at my job, when I've had to fix a bug, maybe display data conditionally, certain users can see this data when they do certain things, or if they have certain permissions. I will search for surrounding words on the page that I'm looking for, or I will trace things back. Like in Django, I'll look at the URL, find like the end of that URL. If it's like user/sign up, I'll go to like the users app, which is just a way of like organizing things in Django, and then go to the urls.py file and look up sign up. And then that will trace to a function that's in another file called a views file. So I'll trace to there, see what that does. And that will trace to an HTML file, which is what's displayed. And then you can see, you could just like keep tracing back like that. Yeah. And if it's a bug and there are errors in the server logs or whatever, that's always helpful as well.
Question.
Yes.
Should I compare a Django environment to a Jupyter environment? Or am I thinking about completely different things?
No, a virtual environment is a virtual environment. And actually, I was just
like an SDK.
Think of a bubble where you're holding. This is a virtual environment. If the code from this library, all these libraries is not in this class, it's going to be in this room, and that could be bad. So if you just want to work and like use the water in this environment to do your thing, that it's a good way to like contain the dependencies that you would need. But Jupyter Notebooks you do have to like get libraries in there to make it work.
Okay.
And what I've heard, correct me if I'm wrong, I have very limited experience with those, that you should put all those libraries in a virtual environment as well.
Okay.
So yeah.
It sounds a little bit like a Linux virtual setup, but I am not familiar with that particular item. So do go on. I hope to learn more.
Yeah. Good question. Okay, so Rails, I don't know if you guys know too much about the Rails framework. They have this like philosophy of outside in, which basically just means check the URL, those words in the URL trace back to a controller, which in Django, it's a view. And then from there, you could trace back and see like the code from the models, which is where the data comes from, or the HTML file where you like display things. It's just all tracing back. Some IDEs, like where you type out the code, like Visual Studio Code they have plugins. So you could kind of like inspect variables. Like you could debug within the IDE. I use Sublime, so I'm not aware of any plugins for there, but that do that. But yeah, I should probably switch over. To fix a bug or like trace back certain things, I'll find like a button on the page and like do like a complete find of all the files. Like I'll search for like text in that button or something like that, and like look for different events like on click, just kind of like play around, I would suggest, and you get a deeper understanding of like what the code's doing. Okay, check out the test suite if you can. Not the unit tests, like you don't really have to be so granular, but if you could run like the test suite, it gives you kind of an overview also how the app works, and like helps you understand some of the use cases too. Like, does this app allow you to like put stuff in a shopping cart, delete things, sign up or register, all that. You could try refactoring, which is kind of, it can be dangerous because once again, like if you just have that two-dimensional view of what you're reading, you could mess up something that you're not even aware of that the original author knew. Like, be careful of this. So be careful with that. And once again, if there's a README, read it. README. Okay, so the Django example, like I mentioned before, I'll trace things back in this way. I just made the slide so you guys have like a visual of how it's traced back. I'll look at the URL, literally. Look at the URL, trace it back to that file, urls.py, find the view function it's associated with, trace it back to the views that that function is defined in the views.py. There's a template that it refers to that's going to be in the templates. And the models are where all the data is. So you could, so another thing that I'll do is I'll go into the shell and grab like the last object from, I'll grab an object in the database and kind of play around with that, but being careful not to delete it or anything like that. Okay. So depending on what kind of developer you are, I'm mostly a backend developer, so I do things more synchronously, like make a request, grab data, do some processing. It's basically like request response type of thing. But so using a debugger helps me a lot. I know front end, they do a lot of asynchronous stuff. So there are events like when you click or key presses. Logging helps a front-end developer kind of figure out what's going on. Logs help you see the flow. Tests kind of help you to see how the flow is driven. Another suggestion I would make is maybe try adding kind of a silly little feature, like maybe a button next to another button and get it to do stuff. Like these features that you'd never actually like push up to production. And eventually you'll start building that three-dimensional model and things will start making more and more sense. And also don't be afraid. This, somebody at my last job taught me this too. If you don't know what a function does, like trace it, take the time, look it up, try to really understand every single thing that you're reading. And the more you do, then you're just going to get faster at it. That's my short little talk, the introduction on what to look for when reading code. Feel free to connect with me, and if you have any questions, let me know.